I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I genuinely appreciate the principles of the gentlelady from California and want to work through this. But we're talking about, I'm worried about ambiguity in the form of statutory construction. And to the best of my recollection, when we went through the Daines Amendment, what we're referring to when we use the term of art data breach, that was when we were dealing with the very principle of this bill in the first place, which is that data breaches are the .gov website, which is regularly monitored and otherwise. And when we identify what is a data breach, which in other words is an unlawful incursion into that data breach by the bad actors that are out there all over the world, and somebody's personal identifying information in the context of that which is held by the government is somehow taken advantage of, it's at that moment that there's an act and a notification and things of that nature. So what we're dealing with is the actor is a bad actor outside attacking our systems. The distinction of a data breach in your language is the lawful activity of a Customs and Border Patrol officer doing their duty and reviewing the whole scope of information that goes through them, which could include certain electronic materials and other kinds of things. And what's ambiguous is, at what point in time does that become a data breach? And that's not what is clear to me. Now, we have, again, already the proscription on any of the things that you were particularly concerned about, which is the inability to do this without probable cause of a criminal act. The downloading and transfer of information, those things are precluded without it being criminally suspicious. What I am concerned about is in the routine process at a border. Who interprets it? You could have somebody claiming that their rights were violated by a Customs and Border Patrol officer because they turned the device on and scanned it and looked and saw that it worked. But somebody could allege that was my private information for my business that I was working on, and that has somehow been, violated because of the ambiguity of what a breach means. And I understand your concerns and believe this is an issue that merits further discussion, because I'll be honest, I don't want us as a committee to leave here without comfort collectively that we can find a way to resolve this, because it's going to be our shared interest to talk to all of our colleagues. We want this bill to be acceptable by our colleagues, recognizing there's hundreds of millions of Americans today who have had their most basic privacy breached by the very people we're concerned about. And we're mixing our concerns here, appropriately worried about the government, but our focus is the bad actors around the world who are attacking us as we speak. We need to put appropriate safeguards, but we do this each and every day. And these are matters of evolving law in the full scope of search and seizure. And so the difference between somebody at the border, what happens 50 miles in the border in a routine police stop and a search incident to arrest, or something which is the normal course of business in which a police officer looks and sees a device, and is there questions about whether he can or can't. These are emerging issues of the law. It's an issue that's before the court as we speak at the border itself. And I would suggest to you that we have an obligation, with the complexity of this issue, to both work out it among ourselves, comfort that we are not creating ambiguity before we put it into a law, and then simultaneously monitor what's happening in the courts as they interpret those things which we do. So again, I go back to willingness to work with the gentlelady and believing that your points are well taken. And none of us want to walk away from this. We want to get it right, but we could also get it wrong and take all of this good work and have it and have it go down. because some of our other colleagues feel that somehow we've left something unaddressed. And I go back. Hundreds of millions of Americans in recent history have been compromised, and that's nothing compared to the real threats of the power grid and other kinds of things. We have an obligation to act, and we as a Congress are the ones, and this is the committee that has taken the lead on getting ahead of this issue. And we can't allow ourselves to get to a point where we dance on the head of the pin and we leave the rest of this nation vulnerable.
Is there any further discussion? Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I respectfully submit that the opportunity and the time to get this right is now. I think far too often when we're talking about issues of security to the homeland, I'm thinking about the Patriot Act and the renewal of the Patriot Act, we leave privacy issues and civil liberty issues to be determined at a later point in order to perfect them with the premium placed on securing this country. And I think it's critically important that we remember the population that we're talking about. And to your earlier point that people are electing to cross the border, in the community that I represent, one half of the largest binational community in the world, people were born in El Paso, raised in El Paso, their family members are on the other sides of the border. It's a part of day-to-day life to cross, in some cases, on a daily basis. In addition to that, you have people who live in El Paso, U.S. citizens who work in Mexico in the maquila industry. They're managers, they're employees, and part of their job entails that daily crossing. Furthermore, when you think about those border checkpoints that are 45 miles into the interior, which all of us have to go through. If I want to use I-10 in either direction, if I want to go up I-25, I have to go to a Border Patrol checkpoint and be subject to these kind of searches and to the civil liberties issues that we're talking about here. That's a experience that I have and 6 million other U.S. citizens who live along the U.S.-Mexico border experience as well. So I think it's critically important that we get this right now. It's critically important that we don't just look at this as discretionary travel and people who elect to cross the border. When I go up I-25 to Albuquerque, I haven't entered Mexico. I live in El Paso, Texas, and I'm going north further into the interior, and I'm subject to these same issues. So I commend the gentlelady from California for raising this right now, for her doggedness and determination to make sure that we settle this issue and that we settle it with a balance that ensures that we don't sacrifice our privacy and our civil liberties in the name of security.
Mr. Gentleman yield?
Mr. Chairman.
With a gentleman yield for?
Mr. O'Rourke?
Yes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and again, I thank you for your very articulate expression of the unique concern that you have, particularly with a search that may happen at a border. But when you talk also about the need to make this happen now, what I don't want you to surrender is the recognition of what I identified before, which is the Department of Homeland Security already having principles, already having meetings done at the highest level, looking to make sure that they get things right. But it is the Department of Homeland Security which is represented and utilizes the privacy information standards, the PII guidelines, which are the most robust that we have. They are accustomed to working through these kinds of issues and working with us to create standards for how they conduct themselves in the balance, but they have been the ones, as we have stated, it is the inclusion of those standards which has gotten the support of the ACLU on this bill. And I submit to you that there are no stronger guardians of privacy than the ACLU. And so you can appreciate that we are not just surrendering this ad hoc to any local police department. But what we would do was include that same agency and that same group to be able to work through the specifics of how this would apply on border searches and determine what we need to do to make sure there are lockdown guidelines that prevent the kinds of issues that are of concern to all of us.
And these concerns that were brought to our attention by Ms. Sanchez through her amendment and that I and others are so passionately advocating for should in no way undermine the work that you and others have done to bring us a bill that I think does so much, so well, to the point that we have such disparate groups as the ACLU and people who are involved in border protection and law enforcement supporting it. However, again, I do think, and this is too often the case, those 6 million plus Americans on the southern border, many millions more along the northern border, are too often left out of these kinds of discussions and bear the brunt of well-intentioned, ultimately misguided practice policy that forces us in some respects to surrender some of our civil rights, civil liberties, and constitutional protections that the rest of the people in this country take for granted. So I couldn't be more strongly in favor of this amendment. I do hope that my colleagues will join me in supporting it. With that, I yield back to the chair.